This is Epicenter, episode 470 with guest Sreeram Kannan from EigenLayer. Hi, Sreeram.
Hi,
Um,
Frederick.
Welcome to Epicenter, the show which talks about the technologies, projects, and people driving decentralization and the blockchain revolution. I'm Friederike Ernst, and I'm joined by Felix Lutsch as my co-host today, and we are speaking with Sreeram Kannan, the founder of EigenLayer, which is a restaking protocol, and what that means we will get to in just a minute. But before we speak with Sriram, let me tell you about our sponsor this week. Omni is your new favorite multi-chain mobile wallet that puts the power of Web3 at your fingertips. In just 3 tabs, you can stake and manage your assets on over 22 built-in protocols, including all major EVMs, Layer 2s, non-EVMs like Cosmos, Solana, Near, and more. Omni abstracts away all the complexity while being fully self-custodial, meaning getting yield on your crypto has never been this easy. Omni also has multi-chain NFT support, so you can view all your NFTs in one place, and you can flex your cleanest NFT by setting it as your app background. Don't forget to check out the Explore section in the app for your daily fix of the hottest dApps, yield, and news across chains. And there's a lot of news recently. Omni recently upgraded to its app to provide you with more functionality than tens of different DeFi apps and wallets combined. To highlight their transformation, they renamed from Stake Wallet to Omni, the next generation super wallet. Join thousands of users on this next generation wallet by downloading it today on iOS or Android at omni.app. Fantastic. So, Sriram, it's a pleasure to have you on. I recently I moderated a panel at DEF CON where you were a very contentious guest. It was on credible neutrality. It was so contentious that we released it as a special episode on Epicenter. Um, we'll talk about credible neutrality and kind of centralization and looming decentralization. I mean, a little bit later in the show. But before we kind of kick it off properly, tell us, how did you get into crypto?
Um, uh, Thank you so much, Frederica. I enjoyed that panel as well, and we could use more frank, candid conversations in this space. And telling a little bit about myself, I got into blockchains per se in 2018, around January, but my interest in peer-to-peer systems dates far back. My PhD thesis was basically in peer-to-peer and wireless networks. This is my master's and PhD span from 2006 to 2011-12. So I've been thinking about these systems. At that time, my interest in wireless was primarily peer-to-peer wireless, and ad hoc mesh networks was mainly thinking through imagining a world where we don't need centralized intermediation for me to talk to somebody else. And we were thinking one of the big use cases for something like this would be last mile coverage, right? Like in developing countries where there may not be enough wireless infrastructure. But actually, we were pleasantly surprised with the scale of infrastructure deployment in developing countries around the world, where the need for something like that didn't emerge. So after my PhD, I switched out and was working on computational genomics for several years, and where we were mainly working on things like how do we analyze data coming from DNA, RNA sequencing, how do genes regulate each other, all this kind of stuff. Totally different from what I do right now. But in January 2018, around that time, my PhD advisor, Pramod, who's now at the Princeton Blockchain Center, so he called me and he said, Sriram, did you hear about this thing called Bitcoin? I said, I heard about it, but I don't know much more. And he's like, oh, the things that we used to think about a lot, how to maximize throughput, minimize latency in peer-to-peer type systems is what, Bitcoin is facing. There's a whole bunch of problems. Do you want to come and work on it? And as interesting as it was technically, I had already been burnt once trying to do something in the peer-to-peer space. And also, I had a kind of intrinsic distrust of financial speculation. And I looked at it at that time, and I wanted to see if there is some more fundamental reason for me to commit to work on that for, like, let's say, a 10-year time scale. And initially I was not convinced, and it took me 3-4 months of like wandering around. And one of my like basic paradigms, which is comes from like evolution, and you can ask like, what is the kind of evolutionary advantage of the species Homo sapiens? And an immediate guess would be something like, oh, we are intelligent, and therefore we've kind of taken over this planet. But I think a moment's examination would suggest that that's probably not true, because if you take one intelligent person and take a gorilla and then give them an island, who has better survival there? So the thesis, this is actually most clearly articulated by Yuval Noah Harari in his book *Sapiens*, that the reason humans have taken over this planet is because we cooperate flexibly in large numbers. I really like this thesis, and it's kind of a foundational mental model for me. And as I think through the thesis and looked at something like Bitcoin, it became clear that the ability to cooperate is limited by trust, right? Like, I'm going to cooperate with you if I know I can trust you. And if I can remove the barriers to trust, then then there'll be more cooperation flexibly in large numbers. So I saw this as kind of like upgrading societal infrastructure and even providing basically an evolutionary advantage for our species in our ability to cooperate flexibly in large numbers. So that became like once I saw that paradigm, that essentially crypto can play a role in upgrading our cooperation infrastructure, I became fascinated with it. And over the next few months, I started diving in deeper. And so I would say that I've gotten deeper and deeper down that rabbit hole in the last 5 years. So that's how I got into crypto.
Nice. So yeah, before we talk about EigenLayer, the project we're here to talk about, I guess one step before that, or where you're still part of, is the kind of University of Washington blockchain lab. Can you
That's
maybe
right.
talk a little bit about what the goal of this lab is, and what you've been researching there, or you're still researching there?
Absolutely.
If you are.
Yeah. At the time, I was working on, like I was saying, computational genomics, but I was a assistant professor at the University of Washington, Seattle. And what ended up happening was, as I got more interested in this, I found that there is a bunch of like basic questions which are unanswered, right? So just looping it back to my thesis, cooperate flexibly in large numbers, Bitcoin already showed us that, you can do trustless cooperation. I would characterize Ethereum as having showed us that we can cooperate flexibly. And Harari uses the word flexibly to differentiate from other species which only cooperate genetically, right? Like army ants cooperate in large numbers, but only genetically. And the way I think about Ethereum is it enabled more flexible cooperation because you can programmatize applications that can then build on top of this common trust structure. And so the thing that I thought was missing at that time is the in large numbers part. And in large numbers basically to me meant we need a much more scalable substrate. So most of our research ended up being thinking about how do we do scalable blockchains, and what are the core features of consensus protocols? How do we get scalability? How do we get the game theory around this right, and so on? So this became the agenda, and this became big enough, to start the UW Blockchain Lab. So earlier it was part of my other research, just one strand. And the goal was basically to understand and create enough primitives so that we can have scalable blockchains. So that was kind of the agenda for the lab. And while doing this, one of the things that I ran into was when you're thinking about how to build new say, consensus protocols or scalability or any of these things, there are very few avenues for you to deploy them into production. So what do I mean by that? Imagine you had a great idea for a distributed application like a smart contract. Then you could then take it and run it on top of any major smart contract blockchain, say Ethereum or any of these other chains that came after that. But if you had a great idea for how to improve the consensus protocol or scalability or adding new features like how to build better oracles or how to build better data availability or any of these things, there is no place for you to go and deploy any of these innovations. In fact, every new innovation requires you having to create yourself a decentralized trust network. And the way I think about decentralized trust is it's like a unicorn. It's so rare and it barely exists. And so it is completely untenable to ask like a good distributed systems engineer to also create decentralized trust along with each of their innovations. This appears rather insane to me, that this is the expectation that we have, that like each person who has a good idea for a consensus protocol, a good idea for a virtual machine, also go and create a social revolution to create decentralized trust. It's just simply untenable. So as I was initially, I didn't understand all of this. My initial thinking was, hey, we have these cool ideas for how to improve consensus protocols. Maybe somebody will take up and use it. And what I saw was there is a lot of governance bottleneck and pressure in big systems, which rightfully should exist. To the next upgrade needs to be made sure that it's really, really accurate, correct, and safe, and it's a long process to get there, and there is no place to do rapid experimentation. So saw that, and I was a little bit frustrated with this state of the ecosystem, that basically the idea that smart contract developers had a variety of options for experimentation, whereas infrastructure builders, which I thought was the core bottleneck, which was limiting the scope of blockchains, did not have the same playground for innovation. And so this became a little bit of an obsession, trying to figure out how do we borrow existing large trust networks to then go and create and let anybody innovate on top of a common substrate. And I would say that was kind of the seeds for what became EigenLayer later, is this obsession in trying to figure out how do we leverage existing trust networks to do new things that it was not designed to do. So that's a little bit of prelude on what we were doing before and how it led to this project.
Fantastic. So EigenLayer lets you piggyback off an existing decentralized trust network. It does that through a mechanism called restaking. Can you explain to us what that is?
Yeah, absolutely, Frederica. The core idea is, when you ask this question, how can we leverage an existing trust network to do other things? It begs the following, secondary question, which is, what is the root of trust of these existing networks? And we can take Ethereum as an example, or Bitcoin as another example. So what is the root of trust of Bitcoin? The root of trust of Bitcoin is the proof of work, which powers, security for this network. And similarly, what is the root of trust for Ethereum is the proof of stake that powers the security for this network. What do we mean by proof of stake powers the security for this network? People are taking their stake, their ETH, and then locking it in a contract, and then saying that I am abiding by the conditions of block production of this network, of Ethereum. And if I deviate from it, if I follow it, give me rewards. If I deviate from it, I have liability that I may lose my ETH. And this constrains the set of possible behaviors that participants in the block production system can exert. They have to make valid blocks. If they make invalid blocks or double signed blocks and so on, they are liable to lose their ETH. So this is the root of trust. So the root of trust of Ethereum is people putting down ETH and committing to both positive and negative incentives for actually making this block. In comparison to, say, Bitcoin, proof of work, where people are buying and investing like mining equipment and using that to mine Bitcoin blocks. And the space of, there is a positive incentive for them. The positive incentive is that if you continue mining on the longest chain, you'll get rewards. And there is a negative incentive, which is that if you don't you try to attack the system or whatever, there's no programmatic negative incentive, but there's a subjective negative incentive, which is that the Bitcoin to USD price may go down, and that adversely impacts the value of your investment, which is this mining equipment. So that's the economics underpinning the root of trust in Bitcoin and, say, the root of trust in Ethereum. What we found was the Ethereum root of trust, or in general, proof of stake root of trust, is much more programmable. And what do I mean by that is you can take the same stake and opt in to additional conditions, additional positive incentives and negative incentives, because it's stake. And stake is programmatically controlled by the blockchain. Whereas you cannot do the same thing on Bitcoin. You cannot take Bitcoin root of trust and then say that I can also opt into additional negative incentives, because any additional negative incentives have to translate to Bitcoin to USD price movements, and that's not possible for us to modulate. So we found that, and it is more fundamental than that, because the core idea is the Bitcoin blockchain cannot go and burn your mining equipment if you do something wrong, and that's because there is a digital to analog translation barrier. Whereas your ETH is stored in a contract, and you can basically burn, lose, transfer, whatever that ETH. So now, having got into the root of trust of proof of stake, we can ask, how can we leverage the same ETH to then also secure other things? Imagine a world where all stakers opt in, restake, which is basically commit their stake to additional services. They say that, hey, I'm going to also run this other data storage network, this Oracle, or this new chain, any of these other things. And they say that if I do not behave correctly on any of these services, I'm liable to lose my ETH. And if it turns out that all of them, all the 100% of ETH stakers opt in, then you have kind of gotten the same root of trust that is underpinning the Ethereum blockchain to also opt in to your service. So you can think of, once you have everybody opted in, everybody restaked, then it's almost as if the Ethereum protocol upgraded itself to make sure you are basically, this other service is being run by everybody who's also running the Ethereum staking. And you can think of two different ways in which trust transfers. One is trust arising due to decentralization. Each stake is widely distributed and staked. So that is one dimension. So to just access that dimension, it is sufficient if the same set of ETH stakers also go and run this other service. But to transfer the economic incentives, we need the stake to be committed programmatically to additional slashing conditions relevant to each of these services. So EigenLayer is a platform that lets stakers opt in both their decentralized trust and economic security to opt in to validating all of these other services. To give a bit of context on the name EigenLayer, Eigen in German for your own, we envision a world where anybody can come and build any new service without having to go find or build their own decentralized trust network. They can leverage this existing massive trust network of Ethereum and then build this on top. We find the timing to be this is the right time to build something like EigenLayer, because we just went through the merge and we are in a fully proof of stake world right now in the Ethereum landscape, as also the layer 2 landscape having significantly driven technology forward, for example, by having sophisticated fraud proofs and validity proofs. And these may be needed for services to exert slashing. So if a service, for example, if I'm running a chain, and in that chain, if you double signed a block or if you signed an invalid block, it should be transparent on the Ethereum blockchain whether that was correct or not. And to do that, you need to have either fraud proofs or validity proofs. And the emergence of the layer 2 actually helps us in basically writing these slashing conditions sharply. So that's a kind of quick overview of EigenLayer.
There's tons to unpack here. Maybe kind of let's roll up historically a little bit before we kind of dive into the weeds here. There used to be the concept of merge mining, or I mean, the concept is still around. It just doesn't really get talked about anymore. So basically, the idea behind merge mining was that if you in proof of work obtain the right to build a block, you would be conceded to build the block on a different chain as well. So basically, so that basically several chains can use the same proof of work. Is this the proof of stake equivalent to merge mining?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is so the restaking. Another way of thinking about restaking is just merge staking, right? And I think this is probably one of the reasons why nobody else came up with it and we came up with it is because, all the OGs who've been around in crypto, like you all here, have looked at this paradigm of merge mining. And merge mining is the idea, like Frederica just explained, that basically if you mine a block in Bitcoin, you also kind of mine a block in this altcoin or this new ecosystem. And merge mining had very limited crypto economic transfer. So what do I mean by that is if you merge mine Bitcoin and some other chain in some other altcoin in parallel, firstly, you need a lot of Bitcoin miners to opt into this other system in order to have any security transfer, because even if you had a majority honest in Bitcoin, if only 5% is merge mining your other coin, then basically you don't have any measurable security, because we know 51% of Bitcoin miners are honest, but doesn't mean 51% of 5% of Bitcoin miners are honest. So you need all the Bitcoin miners to opt in. So that's number one. But even if every Bitcoin miner opts in to this other system, there is still a massive limitation. And the limitation is that even if 100% of Bitcoin miners are mining this altcoin, if they all coordinated to attack this altcoin, what happens is the altcoin system doesn't work, but that does not translate into any kind of like a meaningful loss for them in the Bitcoin, because they can continue to use their Bitcoin mining equipment to mine Bitcoins. So at the end of the day, the transfer of economic security from Bitcoin to any of these altcoins which were merge mined is very weak. And because it's very weak, these systems did not evolve to the extent that people anticipated early on. And once these flaws were identified, people kind of gave up on this paradigm. And I think this is the reason why nobody really revisited this paradigm with the new lens of staking. And what we did, as kind of not having lived through all that experience, is we said, oh yeah, okay, staking means there is slashing. And what this means is if you had like, a $20 billion staked in Ethereum, but even if 5% of it, like $1 billion gets staked in your alternative network, if you misbehave, if you can lose all your ETH, right, the $1 billion of ETH, that is a concrete negative penalty. So the transfer of economic security is nearly perfect in merge staking, whereas the transfer of economic security in merge mining is very limited or non-existent. So once we kind of grokked around this, and this really needs two things. It needs proof of stake. It also needs powerful general purpose programming, because otherwise you cannot have strong programmatic conditions which slash the money when you're misbehaving in all these protocols. So, and both of them were kind of nicely getting well developed in Ethereum. So that's the context for why I think many others who may have come up with it missed it, because of the trajectory of merge mining, which basically didn't work. And I think merge staking works perfectly.
Yeah, I think I've seen you describe also EigenLayer as this programmable slashing protocol, right? And I think one thing's interesting, I guess to some degree, if you think about sharding too, right? Like I guess if you double sign on another shard, you kind of also slashed on the main shard, which essentially is similar, just that in this case, maybe in EigenLayer, you somehow basically have like shards that do like different tasks.
It's
If you
permissionless sharding, basically.
if you want to think about it, yeah. So it's very interesting concept for sure. I have this one question that I definitely want to ask while we're already on the kind of meat of it with the slashing, which is, you know, essentially on Ethereum right now, if you are a big enough like staker, you have this concept of correlated slashing, right? That if like 33% of the network double sign at a certain point, you can have 100% slashing. Now, I guess I'm wondering, since of course, if you add more risks or more services on top that can be slashed, more conditions, and this case might be one of them, you might potentially go like above 100% slashing. Is that, how do you like deal with that? Is there some kind of systemic risk there that the system generates, and how, if there is, or like if how do you think about it, and how do you limit that this happens, which obviously we don't like to see.
No, we don't like to see that at all, and we try to minimize the chances for something like that. But let's zoom out a little bit and see what we envision the main use case of EigenLayer to be. Where we envision EigenLayer to play the biggest role is build services for the Ethereum ecosystem. So if you look at what an application like a dApp today needs, it is paying Ethereum for decentralized trust on block building, right? Like on block making and block validation. But there is a whole domain of other things that are all needed in order to make this application usable. And this could be things like I need oracles, I need bridges, I need MEV management, I need data availability, I need faster settlement, whatever the set of other services in a modular world that you may want in order to actually have the application be trustless. And if you look at this, and when we talk about systemic risk, I think there is a kind of natural thing that people freak out when they see like, oh, you're leveraging trust, it's going to be like trigger systemic risk. But actually, I think EigenLayer significantly reduces systemic risk. And I'm going to kind of make a case for that. And why do I say that? So what is the systemic risk that we see today? If you're an application and you consume trust services from Ethereum, but you also consume trust services from oracles, from bridges, from other things that you all depend on. And in some sense, trust is naturally based on the minimum bottleneck, right? Like whichever is the bottleneck trust, that determines like how much trust you're getting. So you have ecosystem service from Ethereum that basically makes blocks, but you also need all these other things. So imagine if you had like $20 billion staked in ETH on L1, but you have like $1 billion staked in your Oracle, $1 billion in your bridge, and $1 billion in your data availability and other things. Now, the trust that you're getting as an application, what is the cost of attacking all these applications? Find the least trusted one and take over that thing. That is all that is needed to actually attack the whole system of applications. And okay, now imagine in an EigenLayer world, you're fully over leveraged, okay, which is what we are kind of worried about. What does over leveraged mean? Like every staker is doing everything, okay? Every staker is participating in the Oracle, every staker is participating in the bridge, every staker is participating in the data availability. In fact, I'm going to argue that this is the best possible world we can build. Why is this? Because now to attack any one of the applications, you have to attack either the core L1 or one of these services. And if you attacked any one of these services, you're going to slash 51% of that service. So that's the mental model for building on EigenLayer, is you should have, if the safety of that service failed, right, then you should be able to slash a majority of the stakers. So if you take this mental model, then essentially what you can do is to now attack any one of these services, you need to attack like this $20 billion stake. You cannot attack $1 billion stake and take over the system. So the cost of corrupting the ecosystem actually increases under perfect restaking. If you're
But
restaking,
so does the reward, no?
so does the reward. The reward doesn't increase actually. Why? Because you could have already taken that gain by just attacking the L1. So the reason the reward doesn't increase is the same set of dApps. So there is a set of dApps already living on Ethereum. They trust the Ethereum L1, right? And now they were dependent on all these external non-ecosystem services, right? Like oracles, bridges, which were not done by the L1. They were dependent on all of these. And by attacking L1 anyway, you could have attacked these dApps. But because it is trust is the min of many things. If I trust you and Felix and somebody else, and anyway I'm trusting, let's say, Frederica with my life, I might as well trust her with my bag and like other things, instead of like giving those other things to other people. Then my trust exposure actually increases. But the cost of corruption doesn't. The profit from corruption doesn't increase because Frederica could have already taken my life, and she if she doesn't. The same thing is happening with the L1. Is basically already the dApps are trusting the L1 for block production. If you double sign, if you do any basic issue at the L1, you could have taken away kind of like value from the dApps.
I'm with you, part of the argument. So I mean, obviously, if you have a system that is composed out of individual components, the weakest link is what you need to break in order to break the system. Totally with you on this. But if you have different chains or different applications, secured by the same stake, to me, that's not the same thing. So basically, if you have, say, the Oracle that would have been incorporated anyway, yeah, that's still the same system. So if I look at Ethereum now, say Ethereum, the Ether is worth, I'm making this up now, 150 billion, give or take. But the ETH ecosystem is worth 500 billion or 800 billion, whatever. I haven't done the maths, but probably ballpark correct. And that's probably fine. So basically, but if you were to secure like the entire global economy with 150 billion, this would probably not be fine, right? So basically, to me, the question is there a way to mathematically deduce how much you can actually secure economically with the stake that we're talking about here, namely the 150 billion of ETH?
Yes. So we have to. So the first point, I think, what you're saying is, well, if there were applications that already existed on Ethereum today and only they are being served by these additional services, then yes, the profit from corrupting doesn't increase because they're already there. But if it does increase the economy significantly because of like, oh, actually the same money is now securing a much bigger economy, then you'd be under serious trouble. But let me make a contrapositive to this. Imagine we are 4 years back, okay, and somebody comes and tells me ETH is worth whatever 100 million, 200 million today, and there's no way that ETH can secure like a $500 billion worth of an ecosystem. And that didn't turn out to be the case. ETH is now securing a $500 billion worth of ecosystem. And you can ask, why is that? Because ETH grew in value relative to the ecosystem securing it. It is securing. And this is for the good, right? Because actually, the value flow from the fees actually sustains enough value to actually make sure that ETH is valuable enough. And one could make the same argument that by making what the Ethereum secures a little bit more meta, by making it's not only what is run on the Ethereum virtual machine, it's basically anything that the Ethereum Trust Network can secure. You're actually just increasing the scope of applications. What could be built as applications on EVM versus what could be built as applications which are natively new distributed systems that can then be programmed on top. And you could make this argument that basically ETH will grow because you're receiving fees from not only block making, but also from all these other services accrue back to Ethereum. But I think there's a separate part to your question, which is a more mathematical kind of a question. And the question is, what are like exact equations that like calculate and understand this over leveraging? So to do that, we have to actually look at what's happening in the ecosystem today already. And you look at it, you have $20 billion. You said Ethereum's worth 150 billion. Yes, that's true. But each staked is worth maybe less than 20 billion today. But it is securing this $500 billion ecosystem. Why are we not worried about this over leverage? What is going on, right? Like, what's the underpinnings of not worrying about this over leverage? And I think there are two ways to look at it. One is a practical way, and then I'll go to the mathematical way. The practical way is you look at it and you say, oh, you have $20 billion staked. And if you're an attacker, firstly, you have to acquire $20 billion or whatever, 2/3 of $20 billion. And because there is a slashing protocol at work, you're going guaranteed to lose that 6 billion, 7 billion, 13 billion, whatever, depending on what type of attack you're pulling off. So you're guaranteed to lose a whole bunch of money. Whether you are able to make away with a whole bunch of money is anybody's question, right? Like whether you will be able to run away with more than $10 billion from this ecosystem is questionable because of what? Because you don't have exchange liquidity at that scale. You don't have, exit points, and there is frictions, and society will fork you out, and all these other things that essentially constrain the profit from corruption. So the cost of corruption, the cost to the attacker, is guaranteed that they have to take, this $6 billion or $13 billion risk. And the profit that they can make is potentially limited. And these two together constrain the system enough that practically we don't see these attacks.
But you're evading my question, right? So basically, because I'm asking what's the upper bound, and you say, no, but it's lower than the upper bound, which I am sure it is. I mean, so basically, I totally concede that, say, you break Ethereum, the maker token is probably will crash. I mean, totally with you on that. But I mean, is there a way to calculate numbers?
Yeah, that's the next part to the question there. So I just answered the practical way. We can also actually understand these more mathematically. And to do this, actually, you need to redesign Ethereum a little bit. And so, for example, what you need is, okay, how do we mathematically understand, like, what is the limits of leverage and why are we not over leveraged today on Ethereum, right? Before we extend leverage even more to other things that I'm talking about, we have to understand why we are not over leveraged today. So the first part was a practical argument arguing that there is a kind of hardening of security at a certain scale. And that's the argument. But the second part is a more mathematical argument. And what you can do is you can say that the total amount of so whenever there is some kind of an event, there is either a social response or other response which happens within a certain time. And if you can bound the total value flow within that amount of time, so if you can bound that, you will not be able to move more than whatever, 6 billion or 7 billion or something within that time, which is the incidence response time. The incidence response time may be like time to detect a double signed block and then shut down like further transfers. It may be the time for like a community to fork out an obvious a fraudulent fork. So essentially what you want to do is you want to bound the total volume of transactions within the event horizon, right? Like, so there's an event horizon and then there is a total volume, total transaction volume. And right now there is no nice way to do it because we don't know how much Binance transferred. We don't know how much Kraken transferred. We don't know how much some other like mom and pop exchange transferred. We don't know how much somebody sold a Mercedes Benz for and so on, right? Like there's all this activity happening outside and there is no protocol level monitoring. And why am I focusing on only exit paths is because you can kind of categorize transactions into two types. One is transactions that are internally atomic. I'm selling my ETH and getting a bored ape, right? Like I'm selling my ETH and getting a bored ape. This is an atomic transfer inside the blockchain. If it reverts, both revert, right? I either have the ETH or I have the bored ape, and I'm kind of fine both ways. But there are transactions which are not atomic inside the blockchain, right? One leg of the transaction is happening on the blockchain and another leg is happening in the real world, right? These are the ones that get screwed if you actually have like, blockchain reversals and reorgs and things like that. And what you can start doing is, if you can bound the total value of non-atomic transactions per unit time, then you can actually start saying that actually $20 billion is not a bound on whatever is the amount staked, is not a bound on the total value at risk. It is only a bound on the total volume transacted within the event horizon. So that is, you can actually, okay, so this is a whole other discussion. I have a full design for it. How to actually modulate the Ethereum protocol where the slashed funds are used as insurance against reorgs. So you can actually start selling insurance bonds against the slash funds, or at least a portion of the slash funds. Even if half of the funds are burnt, the other half is used for insurance. And anybody who's transacting, and wants protection against, these bad events, actually takes out an insurance from the Ethereum protocol. And by doing this, what happens is the Ethereum protocol creates common information on the total volume transacted within a unit time, because you wouldn't transact huge volume without having commensurate insurance. So anyway, this is a whole other rabbit hole I'm happy to talk more about, but I think you need more sophisticated systems to actually have mathematically bound the over leverage on Ethereum today. And we are building some of these into part of our protocol, at least the roadmap of our protocol, but we do need more native support from Ethereum.
How, what kind of heuristics are you using for the event horizon and the volume? I mean, how would you define the event horizon? How long do you think that is on ETH2?
Okay, so the event horizon depends on the type of bad event you're worried about. And I think one important kind of bad event we should be worried about is short-term reorgs. I claim a block is finalized, right? And I make a lot of transactions. And then I go and create another, as a stakers, they create another fork with another finalized block, right? Which should not happen and is slashed by the slashing protocol. But if there is more money to be made, it could happen.
But with ETH2, that's much more difficult, no? I mean, so basically reorging, I mean, so you can miss a block and you can you can produce a network split by submitting a block deliberately late, but you kind of eliminate most of the reorg mess that we had with Ethereum 1, no?
I mean, eliminate to the extent that it creates an economic damage to the attacker. But if the economic profit to the attacker is 500 billion,
okay, that's it.
So that's the thing that absolutely, right? Like proof of stake created slashing, and slashing creates an economic damage. But I may take the economic damage because my economic profit is higher than the economic damage. And so I think that's the thing, that because producing invalid blocks is not a valid attack on full nodes, which can validate the blocks. So really the only major safety attack is reorging finalized blocks, right? And you can reorg finalized blocks if you have majority stake and you're willing to lose it. And so the question is, suppose somebody reorgs ETH2 block, right? And at what time scale? So if they reorg a block which is 10 days old, likely we will all, even if we slash it, we will continue with the other fork, right? Like the fork in which, which was not 10 days old. But if it was 12 minutes old, which one will we continue with? I don't know, right? And so the event horizon is basically, the time to detect a reorg attack, or the time within which you can effectively make a reorg attack, which will not be rejected. And so that's roughly what I would say. I mean, it's in the order of basically minutes or hours rather than in the order of like months or weeks, right? So and so essentially you have to just bound the economic volume traded within that period. And I think that's why Ethereum is safe today, because of these reasons. And we can imbue something like EigenLayer with the exact same set of conditions, but we can even make it more programmatic because we are building it. We can say that you can not transact more than a certain value per unit time and so on. And that's enough to basically make it very difficult to execute these attacks.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for this excursion, and we would love to see the design of the insurance thing. That actually sounded super cool. I hope we'll learn more about that soon. I wanted to take it back, obviously, about the topic. We also want to talk about like EigenLayer itself, right? A little bit, kind of the economics, the participants. We were talking a little bit about the validators basically opting into these other services. Probably you could also see maybe like liquid staking protocols forcing their validators essentially to opt into certain services. And then on the other hand, you have people paying for these EigenLayer services that are being provided. Is that correct? And then I guess how or who pays, first of all? Is it the applications? How do they pay for that? What are kind of like models, and then who then receives the I guess that's the validators again, but maybe you could talk a little bit just about like how this.
So the economy that is underpinning this. So one way we think about the economy underlying EigenLayer is to start with first principles. And the first principle is the core value proposition of blockchain is decentralized trust. And how we think of EigenLayer is a marketplace for decentralized trust. If decentralized trust is such an important thing in this blockchain economy, we need a marketplace where decentralized trust is bought and sold. And people had recognized this in other ways. And one way of thinking about it was block space as a kind of like a unit of decentralized trust. But we think that's not the right level of abstraction. Decentralized for block space is not the right level of abstraction for the generic nature of decentralized trust. You may want to run a new distributed system. You may want to run like a secure multi-party computation, whatever that was not natively in the protocol, right? So the right unit is, you have this decentralized trust network and you are basically committing to do additional validation. And the question is, how much value are you willing to take for it, right? And so to elucidate this economy a bit, so there are two sides to this market. One side is stakers who are then offering their decentralized trust services to others, right? And the other side of the market is we think of them as middlewares, but they could be generic distributed systems, right? Services that are built on top of this. These services, just to make it concrete, let's think of the data availability service that we're building. You can think of it just simply as a data storage service. It's not a data storage, it's data availability, but just for simplicity, let's think of it as, hey, I'm going to take some blob and throw it into this network, and they have to store this blob for this amount of time. Right? And now you want to do this. Who is paying for this? So somebody creates this service. Let's say, Frederica and Felix wrote this service. They want to create a data storage service. They wrote it, and then they're tired of like pumping and shilling a new token. So they say, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to run it on EigenLayer, just throw it on this distributed network. And they do it, and they say, there's a Frederica and Felix wallet, right? Like, so you have a wallet, and you say that anybody who's paying, and you also create an economy around it. You say anybody who wants to store data on this distributed network needs to pay $1 per byte or 1 ETH per byte or whatever, right? 1 ETH per gigabyte, okay? So you have this 1 ETH per gigabyte, and now somebody else who wants to use this service, they come and they have some interfaces. They store the data on this like decentralized network, and they pay that 1 ETH per gigabyte to store that data. And when Frederica and Felix created it, they also created a distribution economy, which said that, yeah, we will take 30% of this like 1 ETH per gigabyte, and the remaining 70% goes to the validators. And the validators look at it and they say, does this make sense for me or not? And they opt in if it makes sense, if that economy makes sense for them. And so every time when somebody comes and stores data, they collect that 1 ETH, and that 1 ETH, 0.3 ETH goes into your wallet, and then the remaining 0.7 ETH gets redistributed among all the stakers. So so there is really a third party, like there was originally a service, and then there was the stakers. And then there is service users of that service, which could be rollups, which could be applications, like distributed applications, which should be end users who just want like a Dropbox type thing to be built on a blockchain. So that's the economy. The economy is basically the creator of the service decides how value is apportioned between the creator, the innovator, and the service providers, the stakers, right? So how this economy is distributed. And once they set forth the set of these conditions, what they actually do is, a service creator. So to delve into this a little bit more, the service creator also creates a container which the stakers should be able to download and run, which does this particular service, downloading and storing the data for this amount of period if fee has been paid. And they also create a smart contract. The service or middleware creates a smart contract which talks to the EigenLayer smart contracts and establishes who can participate in the system, each stakers with whatever, at least so much staked, or do you allow staked ETH holders? What is the entry condition to participate in your particular service? That's the first part. The second part is what is the payment condition, or it is actually 1 ETH per gigabyte, and 0.3 goes to the creators and 0.7 goes to the stakers. That's the payment conditions are encoded in the smart contract. And finally, negative incentives like slashing are also encoded in the smart contract. It says, oh, if there is a recall game, and then I say that randomly I'm going to recall some bytes and you have to produce it, and if you don't produce it, you'll get slashed. Right? So some kind of like a negative incentives. Those are encoded into the smart contract. Now, if you're a staker, you're participating in EigenLayer, you can go and express your preference whether you want to opt into this particular service or not. And you go in and sign a thing and say that, yes, I want to opt into this particular service. Then you're registered for that service, which means you're supposed to be providing it. And if you violate some conditions stated in the smart contract, then you will get slashed. But if you don't violate any of those things, you will continue to receive payments at the encoded rate. So that's the core economy of EigenLayer. So to build an EigenLayer service, you have to write an off-chain container that stakers can download and run. It can be in arbitrary language as of now. And there is an on-chain slashing contract or on-chain contract, service contract you have to write, which controls gating, who participates, positive incentives and negative incentives. These are all encoded into the smart contract. And so when somebody is opting into a particular EigenLayer service, they know exactly what set of things they're opting into.
How much due diligence does this require from the validators, right? So basically, if I'm a mom and pop validator, do I know which things I should be validating on? If it's too difficult to discern which ones are good things to co-validate for, I might be foregoing yield, which might make it economically unviable to validate myself. And I mean, this is something that the network needs, right? And so basically, we've seen decentralization, for other reasons. So I mean, basically, people just stake with their exchanges, or there's Lido, and don't get me started on proposal builder separation and MEF boost, whatever. So basically, I mean, we've seen these. Will this add to this entire situation?
It adds and it subtracts, and I'm going to explain both sides. How much due diligence does a home staker need? And what we're trying to do is to create audit economy around these EigenLayer services, right? So there is going to be, just like smart contract audits is how like users trust smart contracts to do the things that they say in the white paper or whatever other things. So there is a barrier for a user to use a smart contract. In the same way, now there is a barrier for staker to opt into new services. So there is a attendant audit economy that is needed, and we want to absolutely minimize the amount of diligence that somebody has to do. And there may be multiple categories of services, those that are kind of vetted by us and, or some other reputed agencies and so on, and and stakers may feel more inclined to opt into them, and there may be others that basically so you can imagine a world where a home staker says, yeah, give me Frederica's curation of services. I only like opt into everything that Frederica says, right? And that should be possible. And if somebody says, no, actually, I want to be the one who wants to make the decision, that's also, something that is available in this free economy. Okay, so there is a bit of barrier on auditing, vetting, like what these services are. So that is something that, but it can be kind of delegated, right? Like just that ability to say that I'm trusting X for doing the delegation and I'm just following along. And in terms of missing out on yield, I think like everywhere else, there will be a power law. There will be maybe 3 services that account for pretty much all of the yield, like 90% of the yield in this kind of a platform. And it's the same way, like we have dApps, and there are thousands of dApps, and maybe 3 account for pretty much all of the fees today on Ethereum. And there'll be a similar thing, and where a home stakers just opt into these 3 services and essentially get all of the yield. And so one of our interests is in making sure that these services are as lightweight as possible, that a home staker should be able to opt in. And this is a kind of like a guiding principle for us, is actually we think something is scaling only if each node needs to do very little, but the system can do a lot, right? Like a scalable system basically means that each node does little, but the system together does a lot. And that's when decentralization and scalability are not in fundamental tension. And we think that we have, in general, the ecosystem, as an ecosystem, we have understood enough principles that actually we know how to build systems which scale horizontally. For example, our data availability service is built in such a way that each staker needs like 0.3 megabytes per second in network bandwidth. But together, the system bandwidth is 15 megabytes per second. So it is not based on everybody needing to have a lot of computational infrastructure. It is based on everybody doing a little, but data being distributed through this network and thus achieving scaling. So one part of the answer is making it easy to do audits and follow along other people's like recommendations. Another part of the answer is there's only a few services which will matter, and we try to make those services be easy for home stakers to participate in. And I think there's a third dimension to this answer, which actually I'm most excited about. So if you look at the whole MEV and other things going on in Ethereum, one thing we'll see is there is a lot of discussion about how to keep home stakers decentralized. And if you just examine the system objectively, there is a gradient or pressure to centralization, but there is no gradient or pressure to decentralization. The system doesn't have it. We only enforce it socially or religiously, right? Like the system by itself has no pressure. There is no advantage in being decentralized. There is some advantage in being centralized. So there is a gradient or pressure to become more centralized. And all we are trying to do when we're doing, MEV boost or PBS or any other like design consideration is how to minimize the gradient to centralization. That's all that's being done. There is no gradient to decentralization. It's not there. And because decentralization is not objectively measurable, it's not possible to make the protocol recognize and incentivize it, even though it's one of the most critical aspects of building the Ethereum protocol. So we are very excited about the role EigenLayer can play in this. What is this? So in EigenLayer, we don't want the platform to exert subjectivity, but we want middlewares or services consuming, decentralized trust to exert subjectivity. What do I mean by that? For example, imagine Felix is building a service. This service is based on, threshold encryption. Okay, so part of threshold encryption is dividing some secret into many chunks, and each person holds a chunk. And if they all don't collude with each other, or at least majority of people don't collude with each other, the secret remains a secret. Okay, this is an example of something which is not based on economic security. This is based purely on decentralization, because people should not be able to collude with each other easily. If it's just like, so there are certain things, certain services which can absorb trust from economics, and there are certain services which only absorb trust from decentralization. And threshold encryption is a great example of something that only absorbs trust from decentralization. So Felix may come in and say, when building on EigenLayer, that he doesn't care about who has how much ETH, but he has some subjective measurement of decentralization. Maybe he comes in and says, I only want Rocket Pool stakers to participate in his system. Or he only wants certain home stakers to participate in his system. Or he has an Oracle feed that he himself creates. And it says only people in this, my whitelist can participate in this ecosystem, because he has somehow subjectively vetted that they are actually more decentralized. So if this happens, then what happens is that then Felix is paying for decentralization. So the decentralized quorum can potentially earn even more than a centralized quorum, creating a gradient, a pressure to decentralization. Because decentralized trust is, so another way of thinking about it is, if we all value decentralized trust, why are we not paying for it? Because the rich expressive markets to value decentralized trust don't exist today. And if you allow for rich expressive markets to value decentralized trust, people will pay more for things to be decentralized in things that you care about. And we don't know how the economics is going to play out, but at least there is a possibility to create a gradient for decentralization. This is something that I'm super excited about as a possibility for what EigenLayer can do.
What kind of services do you see building on top of EigenLayer? So basically, what are the biggest use cases you see coming on top of EigenLayer?
So, of course, we are building the first service ourselves, which is a data availability service. And the reason we chose to double down on building a data availability service is, of course, the Ethereum roadmap is strongly oriented towards modular ecosystem where rollups basically write data into Ethereum and write commitments. And one of the things that we want to see is a world where thousands of rollups can flourish. And to do this, you need much more data bandwidth than available on Ethereum today, and even in the foreseeable future, including things like dark sharding. We want to provide 100x, 1000x more data bandwidth than what is available. And the set of techniques already actually have been pioneered in the Ethereum research community, and we can build, much more flexible engineering modules around these basic cryptography, like using, things like KCG polynomial commitments and how they were used in dark sharding. We can take them and engineer many different kinds of systems around it. So data availability is one example of what we are building, and which could be a very useful ecosystem service. And we are trying to build it in a way that stakers of all shapes and forms can participate in it. That's one example. Another example of what could be built on top of EigenLayer is a whole host of MEV management services. Why am I talking about MEV management services? Is if you're staking in Ethereum, but you're also restaked on EigenLayer, then you can start making credible commitments about your behavior. You can say, for example, I'm selling you a portion of my block space. You're doing an auction, but you're not doing an auction where you're selling the entirety of block space, which is what is happening in the MEV boost market today. Whereas what you could do is you could say, yeah, I'm selling most of my block space, but I still retain the ability to add stuff at the end of my block space. Okay, this is something that you could do. In fact, we had a design for this we call MEV Boost Plus Plus, which is basically saying you are auctioning off the rights to fill some portion of the block, but there's still space at the end of the block where I can add in as a block proposer whatever transactions that I want at the end of the block. So you don't have to make a trade-off between expressing my preferences as a block proposer and the economic upside of having to participate in an MEV market. I can do both. So this is one example of what you can build on EigenLayer as an MEV service, but there's a whole host of other things. You can start doing things like multiple block builders, decentralized block building. What I do is instead of selling all my block space to one person, I say, oh, I'm selling the first 30% of my block space to Frederica, the next 30% to Felix, and so on, right? Like I can start doing more of these things. And what does EigenLayer particularly enable in it? The idea that if I don't stand by my word, if I told Frederica that I'm going to include 30% of her transactions in the first portion of the block, but I don't, then I could be slashed on Ethereum, right? So that I could lose my ETH, and that gives Frederica some trust in me in actually making this transaction possible. So the ability to make credible commitments actually opens up the space for how we do transaction ordering priority. Even things like I want to build a threshold encrypted mempool. So I commit to maybe selling the first 30% of my block space, and then I say that the remaining 30% or the next 30% I'm going to use threshold encryption. And I agree, I send a signature saying I'm going to use the decrypted version of these encrypted transactions. And if I don't include them in the block, then I'll get slashed. So it opens up the space for anybody to come in and innovate on MEV management services. So that's one huge category. There are also other things there, things like I want to do event-driven activation. For example, Felix is like, hey, whenever I'm under collateralized on Compound, then refill my collateral from my wallet at this address. And that's just a kind of standing instruction, event-driven instruction that he wants to give. You can do this today using this category of like middlewares called keepers, which like Gelato and Chainlink has something, and there are others building it. But the problem with those services is there is a kind of non-attributability problem, whether that node triggered the transaction but the transaction was not included in the block, or that node did not trigger the transaction and therefore it was not included in the block. This is not attributable. Whereas on EigenLayer, if a block proposer opts into these event-driven conditions, if a block proposer opts into these event-driven conditions, then it's uniquely attributable because the block proposer, of course, controls block space. So this is another example. There's all kinds of other examples like whole block flash loans and other like crazy economic objects you can start building. Because block proposers are staked, they can kind of opt into covenants on what they cannot break. So this is one class of solutions, MEV management. Questions? Comments?
Yes, let me move away from the financialized use cases a bit. So in principle, there's lots of things that you would love to have a trust network for that are non-financialized and consequently currently crowded out of the truly credibly neutral blockchain, which is Ethereum. So can you kind of make it viable for them to run on EigenLayer?
Absolutely. I think one consequence of like high performance data availability is if you have like a huge amount of data availability bandwidth, now you can start running applications which are simply financially priced out, right? And one of the ways we think about this is if you look at the current networks, the operational cost of running the network is far lower than the capital cost of staking, right? Like I'm putting $20 billion of staking, so I need at least a 10% or 7% some APR, so I need at least $2 billion annually in return, right? So that's the capital cost of staking. And then there's an operational cost of like scaling and providing whatever services that you want. And actually the operational cost is not at all dominant, right? Today, staking cost is dominant. So you can overlay more operations and still, not suffer significant cost. That's one part of it. The other part of it is actually just by better engineering, you can use the same amount of bandwidth much more efficiently. And that's the part I was talking about in our data availability, is by actually every node doing a little, but together they do a lot. And by scaling across nodes, you can actually provide a huge amount of bandwidth for applications to consume. And this is one of the reasons we actually built the data availability first. Is just like opens up the volume of use cases, from use cases where there was high amount of value flowing per bit of data, to use cases where you don't need a lot of value flowing per bit, and then open up to the long, use cases where like there is going to be a lot of data needed to be transmitted to arrive at uh, to still like leverage the credible neutral platform like Ethereum for that.
Let me zoom right out. So, I mean, if you look at EigenLayer as a concept, it's kind of a different paradigm in scaling. So, I mean, so currently in scaling, we have layer twos, we have like the IBC, style connected layer ones, and now we kind of have this piggybacking mechanism that is EigenLayer. Can you talk about how these compare, and whether piggybacking often existing economic system has negative externalities for just that system? So basically, does it do anything? Does it take away anything from Ethereum that you're using this as well as an economic trust layer?
I think it goes back to mostly the leverage type questions that we talked about earlier, right? That's one part. So I won't go into the same thing again. But what other issues are there? One other issue is the same stake is committed now for Ethereum, but for also to do these other validation tasks. And the one thing to understand is Ethereum is the primary and everything else is the secondary in this market, because you're staked in ETH. And the actual mechanics, which I didn't go into earlier, is you stake in Ethereum and then you set the withdrawal powers to the EigenLayer smart contracts. And so what happens is Ethereum has like first dibs at slashing. Ethereum is the primary loan holder, so to say. Everybody else is a secondary on this platform. So that means actually that Ethereum protocol has the priority on slashing. So I don't think it affects the core properties. There's one thing though, which is just temporary, and we hope that it'll get sorted out eventually, is the idea that when somebody is slashed on EigenLayer, when does Ethereum get to know about it, right? Like if there is a huge delay and like the person is actually completely slashed already, they don't have anything remaining, and Ethereum thinks that they have a lot, but actually they don't. And this problem can be minimized by a feature in Ethereum called smart contract triggered withdrawals. If the EigenLayer smart contract can immediately, the way slashing happens is they immediately triggers withdrawal from Ethereum, then basically you don't have this principal agent type problem. So that's another dimension that we've discussed with the EF people. And I think in general, something like smart contract triggered withdrawals helps all kinds of staking protocols. But other than that, I don't see any significant other aspects to the.
You would always withdraw the entire validator, like all 32 ETH for every slashing. I could imagine like some slashings being kind of minor to just kind of discourage you.
So I think one of the principles we're using for EigenLayer slashing is to be as rare as possible, and when it happens, to be as severe as possible. So as severe as possible, because we don't slash for things like uptime. We only slash when there is like a significant safety failure, provably malicious action. So when there's a provably malicious action, we don't need to slash a little. So slashing is designed to be very rare and severe when it actually happens.
But this you mean, is this for your specific service you're building, or because I guess that's kind of customizable for
That's
someone
right.
that
That's right. But that's the recommendation for all these services, and we want to, because we don't take slashing ETH lightly, and I think it should not be taken lightly by any service either. Especially because of this primary secondary type problem that we talked about, and it should only happen when there is a clearly provable malicious action.
If I'm slashed, do I have a recourse? So basically, if say for instance, I'm evil, and I build a service on top of EigenLayer that uses a malicious contract to slash unsuspecting stakers. Do they have a recourse? Can they do something against this?
Absolutely. So this is something we take very, very seriously, and no amount of audit and other things is sufficient to guarantee that there is no like edge case and malicious code base in slashing. So I think that is a significant problem, and especially in EigenLayer, which couples trust across multiple systems, it could very well happen that all ETH stakers opt into Frederica's evil contract, and they all get slashed, and it could be like an absolute nightmare. So the way we deal with this is by requiring or enabling what we call a slashing veto. There is a veto for slashing run by a reputed committee. The only thing this committee can do is basically veto slashings. And you can think of basically slashing needs approval both by the contract and by this committee in order to actually pass. So that's the trust model, is basically you're trusting one of these two to work correctly to protect against slashing errors. And if both are malicious, then there is a problem.
Okay, but that's currently social consensus, right? So basically, if it's a pool of known individuals who say clearly Friederike is out of her mind. This was not a slashable offense. Give back the stake.
That's correct. So this system relies on both neutral, objective algorithm, just smart contract, plus a social layer. So the things that blockchains have natively is a social layer to fork the chain if something crazy happened.
Sure.
And we are an overlay layer, and we don't have the ability to fork Ethereum or we don't want to assume the ability to have fork Ethereum when something bad happens. So we are incorporating the social layer into the protocol, and that's a necessary. And so this layer is not run by a economic committee. We do not think that it's correct to have a token committee or whatever, run this thing. It should be run by trusted individuals, reputed entities in the ecosystem.
Yeah, that makes sense. Coming back to the second half of my question, how does this compare and contrast with other scaling solution? Basically, loosely meshing EigenLayer with layer 2s and IBC connected blockchains.
Yeah. How does it compare and contrast? So EigenLayer is designed for a modular world. So it is designed for the roll-up world. So it doesn't add particularly anything to one part of the roll-up world, which is, you want to do zero knowledge proofs or other economic games in which you can actually prove that your execution state is correct. I think that is something that we like a lot, and it's completely complementary to what EigenLayer is offering. So it does offer something in terms of our particular solution on data availability, but also for the ability for others to build even better data availability solutions on top of EigenLayer. I think that is something that we are quite excited about. The fact that the area of open innovation can be quite large there. In terms of other services, other kind of paradigm. So just to add a little bit more there, for things like optimistic rollups, you have a layer of economic security, which is the sequencer is basically making a claim that what they said is correct. And then you also have a layer of verification, which is that they'll get slashed if that doesn't happen correctly. On things like EigenLayer, you can reuse a lot of stake and provide more economic security for things like optimistic rollups. So that's something interesting. It adds to the optimistic rollup ecosystem. On the ZK rollup ecosystem, I think one thing something like EigenLayer adds is, proof verification on Ethereum is still expensive, right? And it is expensive because of some basic fundamental limits. If you use the Ethereum blocks only to do like ZK proof verification, maybe you can do like 15 to 30 ZK proof verifications per block. So that's the current like block size and gas consumption of these things. So if you had a world where there are like thousands of different rollups, then they cannot all write ZK proofs into Ethereum every block. So that's not possible. But what they can do is, if there was a kind of like restaked quorum of all the Ethereum stakers and they all verify. But the fact is, verifying ZK proofs is very trivial off chain, right? Like you can run it in parallel. You can check hundreds of ZK proofs in parallel. Each of them may take only like tens of milliseconds. And so you can actually verify thousands of ZK proofs. So in a reasonable node. So the question is like on an off-chain. So the proposal could be something like you can create a service on top of EigenLayer where all the ETH stakers participate and they verify like thousands of ZK proofs in parallel, and then they just certify that they have verified all of this on Ethereum. So this could be an example of a kind of synergy with things like zero-knowledge rollups. And the one thing we see in ZK rollups today is they wait for a long time to batch because of the verification costs. And you don't need to do it, and you can have a bridge which moves data between the rollup and Ethereum every block if you had a layer like this. Going to your broader question on things like IBC and the external ecosystem, EigenLayer bears close similarity with what is called interchain security, right? Which is basically one chain providing security to other chains. I think there are a couple of important differences. Interchain security, as it is being talked about today, is the provider chain has to have a governance upgrade to opt in to serve this other chain. And I'm just working in this space for enough time. Anything that has a governance upgrade, I'm like, okay, that's too slow. So I like the nature of like what we are doing with EigenLayer, which is basically validator level opt-in. It's permissionless. Each validator make a decision and opt in. I think it reduces frictions massively. And the second thing is the way we think about what should be built on EigenLayer, which is more of a subjective opinion, but I think it aligns deeply with the Ethereum landscape, is to build modules, each module being secured by the same stake, rather than to build chains, which is what interchain security is optimizing for. Okay, to add to your last question about IBC in particular, right? IBC is inter-blockchain communication, is the standard for talking between different blockchains. I think we need a powerful IBC port for Ethereum. And I'd be very excited to see people build something like that, for example, on EigenLayer, because what you can do is once you have stakers opt in, you can verify signatures from all these IBC connected chains and just make an economic certificate saying that, yeah, we all know that this is the set of signatures in these other chains. So that's an example for how what can be built on EigenLayer.
Thanks for expanding so far into it. I think we're also like been at it for a while. I think we can slowly get to kind of wrapping up. Maybe for the final question, we can talk a little bit about where the project is at right now. I mean, we talked a lot about what is theoretically possible. Maybe we can hear a bit, where are you at right now? What's on the roadmap in like the immediate future?
The way we're building EigenLayer is initially we are building the first service ourselves, and on launch there'll only be the one service, the data availability service we are building on top of it. And we want to slowly open it up from being a one service platform to a few like partnered services to then to be a self-serve platform on which anybody can come and build anything that they want. So we'll see the first service launch hopefully mid next year. And then we'll have a whole bunch of other services on board in the months following. So that's the roadmap. Right now we are in internal testnet. We have a few integrations we are testing inside the internal testnet. So that's where we are, and we'll hope to have a more public facing testnet in the months between now and launch.
Fantastic. We look forward to that. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, Sreeram. I have learned a lot. This is such an interesting project. Excited to see where this takes you.
Thank you so much, Frederica. I've had, really, really enjoyed talking to you and Felix on this podcast. Look forward to be in touch in the future.
Cool. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Felix. Thank you, Frederica.